In your essay on Gabriel Rockhill, you recall a rumor circulating in the Korean student movement of the 1980s that the Frankfurt School and postmodernism were CIA-funded departures from revolutionary politics. Reading Rockhill's Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, what made you return to that atmosphere? Why has the language of compromise theory become so powerful for parts of the left again?
So I came across the Rockwell's book due to my friend and wrote about it, and then many the controversial debates over that the argument is Rockwell suggested, and then that's why just actually that kind of controversy actually brought me to read Rockwell's book. Then I found out the general logic in the book. Rockwell actually already hypothesized and through his discussion of the Western Marxism, really actually spitting image of what I already experienced in 1980 in South Korea. There's actually even the logic is quite similar. What I mean actually they thought they actually the they argue that Western Marxism was funded by the CIA, and then that is kind of a CIA propaganda, something like that. So to destroy Soviet Union, and then I didn't actually know the rumor that began and then originated. Actually, I didn't actually follow it fully. Anyway, actually partially thought you know that would that would be possible. That means actually not 100% wrong. I thought that might be some 1 or 2% might be historically the correct, and the historical fact will be there because CIA actually the working in the countries in this region. After the Second World War, CIA is very familiar. The organization we can encounter during the rather years. That is what I mean. Actually, that's why just we thought. But that is exactly what I want to say is a Cold War logic, is a Cold War sectorism, something like that. So actually that they divide, the whole world into two parts, and then doesn't care about, the which one is correct and which one is, the incorrect. They try to suppress the kind of speculation by which we can get into the truth of that factuality. Don't want actually, the people. They don't want people to get into the kind of complicated discussion. They wanted to mobilize people rather than people's speculation on that, or the truth or the people's engagement in that kind of the knowledge or some information. So that is what I thought, and then when I went to the England for my study, I found out, the many documents, such a rumor will be actually such a rumor were actually, produced by some the Soviet Union, the Soviet agency, something like that, is a kind of a rival to the CIA, who try to wield their kind of power to protect their interests, use the kind of information, not just the philosophical engagement in the politics, protect their own regime. The regime is the protection of regime is always prior to any political the truth or some any historical engagement. That's what actually I thought when I found out that kind of rumor would be manipulated by both sides. The American the agency, and then secret agency, the Soviet secret agency. But that situation as such, in my opinion, impasse of the political failure.
Yeah. And, a thing in Gabriel Rockhill's book is that he reconstructs the imperial institutions that are funded and circulated theory. In your discussion of Thailand, in American anti-communist apparatus actually helps place Marxist texts into circulation. While those texts later acquire radical uses it cannot control, does does a history of sponsorship become politically limiting when it treats the theory as a limit of its possible use?
So actually, the Rockhill emphasized, and CIA supported the Pipers. In his own term, might be a Western Marxist. A problem is, Western Marxists didn't call themselves Western Marxists. It's the most Western Marxism as such, this term as such, at some point quite a mocking word among European leftists. Perry Anderson, they call these people as Western Marxists because he tried to put distinction between the Eastern Marxism, what I mean, like official Marxism, and the some sort of, according to his own interpretation, liberal Marxism or cultural Marxism. Then, of course, he supported the Gramsci rather than Western Marxism, but he also distantiated himself from Western Marxism. That's why he used this term. But the Western Marxism, in this sense, at some point, is temporary term. To define a certain Marxist movement, which tried to sublate, the Union. That means like Stalinism. What I mean, actually, what is Stalinism? In my opinion, the crystallization of Marxist and Leninism. That is Stalinism. Kind of, some kind of replication of the Marxist, the revolutionary spirit. In my opinion, that is Stalinism. So I don't say Stalinism is the bad and the evil. I don't want to say it. Stalinism is kind of the dilemma, all right, dilemma. And then it means like kind of some paradox, and then the Stalinism also, in my opinion, let us know what is the main purpose of a communist movement. It must abolish the state. But if we actually retain the state, the actual state would, turn back against that kind of communist movement. That is, we already recognize it. So I think Western Marxism is kind of, such a philosophical insight. It's a philosophical speculation on the failure of a communist movement. That's what I understand. If we take actually cases of, Asian, the movement, we also had, this kind of communist movement after the Second World War. That is exactly, I think that the Rockhill actually misunderstood because he actually simply focused on the, how CIA, promoted the Western Marxism. No, actually, the evidence to show that CIA is direct, the connection with Western Marxism. All right. They would, the fund, finance, but in those days, there wasn't, the CIA, OSS or something like that. Actually, the FBI occasionally supported, the Western Marxist, it's not the Western Marxist, directly, but the institution in which the Western Marxism, the originated was some kind of a Frankfurt School. That means actually the Frankfurt School is very complicated, all right? It's just not one single guy, the rule over the Frankfurt School. Many different, members. So he actually mixed up this kind of historical fact, and then he didn't actually, put down, the how CIA actually, use this the so-called Western Marxism to ruin this kind of communist movement. Occasionally, we can criticize Western Marxism too much theoretical. Then at some point, as Perry Anderson said, isolated, from this kind of mass movement, something like that. And then Adorno, in my opinion, you could criticize Adorno, couldn't, understand the paradigm shift, in those days, something like that. The paradigm shifted from that kind of some elite, movement to the mass movement, something like that. So you can criticize it, but it doesn't mean, actually the CIA is directly connected to connecting, the Western Marxism to their own project. We cannot find out. But another actual thing is that the problem of Gabriel Rockhill, actually, I found that when I read his book, definitely he didn't know, the place exactly, to show that kind of evidence. CIA, directly connected to this kind of so-called Marxism is Asia. He didn't discuss Asia, The CIA actually works this area, actually after Second World War in Thailand. Thailand is definitely the place. Thailand is, in my opinion, beginning of a CIA project relevant to this kind of Marxism. Donovan, one of the early, member of the CIA, Donovan actually argued the OSS is kind of a temporary, the temporary actually agency. They actually engage this kind of the warfare during a Second World War. And after Second World War, they actually dismissed, and then shifted to the the now today's we as know the CIA, the Donovan, and then of course actually Hoover the founded this CIA, this actual secret agency. But the Donovan insisted we need kind of a permanent information the agency. That is the reason why they actually agreed to found the CIA, right? Which actually place the CIA really actually concentrated on those days. The third world, not the Europe. Of course, Europe also actually very disturbing. The European the line. It means like the De Gaulle and then on the European nationalists didn't follow the American the order. Okay, just the De Gaulle actually the announced like a third world, the third world, sorry, third way actually in between Soviet Union and then, actually the United States. So they actually insist the third way, something like that. But third world also, actually these, India and Indonesia and many actually, the country in Asia, they also announced, non-aligned movement. And then they also follow this kind of the third world movement, right? But that is a situation. CIA actually normally, mainly actually what? Played their role in this area, not Europe. That is important. Actually, that means actually we can find out a direct connection between, the Marxism and the CIA in this area, all right?
Yeah.
But what happened, what happened actually to Asia, that is more important, when the first generation failed, in their own movement is we experienced, the terrible, the genocide and then massacre, in South Korea. And then, of course, actually the Korean War happened. And before the Korean War, we had a disastrous massacre in Jeju Island. There might be actually the civil, the civilian massacre, which happened after Second World War in human history. So like today's Gaza, actually that thing happened. But who did that one? Of course, actually, the behind this actually the massacre. Of course, there was the United States. United States actually ruled over those days southern part of the Korean Peninsula. And then, of course, actually this thing has happened and they repeated what? Where? Indonesia and then in the Philippines. They came down this area and they actually did same thing. They killed the innocent people. Of course, these things are actually happening in those days. And then the CIA actually, when the CIA was established, CIA actually manipulated, many things, regime change, assessing the important activists and the intellectuals. That thing is really normal in those days, in this area. So I think that might be the more serious, serious actually issue, than the whether the CIA supported Western Marxism or not. You must discuss this, but this is more urgent, the issue, in my opinion. So that thing happened in Thailand. There's a beginning. I already discussed in my article. They at CIA used the Marxism to the dismantled the monarchy.
Yeah.
Thai monarchy, and then you would actually watch this kind of the interview done by the Lee Kuan Yew, the first the president of Singapore. He explained even the Lee Kuan Yew was not he's not Democrat, he's not a democratic leader, but more like actually the dictator. But actually, he was also manipulated by. He was also the one irritated by CIA. Actually, CIA actually tried to engage in Singaporean politics, something like that. That is the CIA tried to bribe, the one of the cabinet member. You're going to be really angry about that, something like that. That is things that happened in the 1960s, 1970s Asia. I think that might be the much important, evidence you can find out, how the CIA, connected to this kind of political movement, or somehow CIA tried to destroy this kind of radical movement, in the world.
Yeah, and one thing I noticed in your essays, the last two essays that you wrote, and which are on your Substack, is related to the category of Western Marxism. I know you mentioned a little bit earlier about the limits of it and utilizing that characterization. But when you put it in relation to the Thai and Korean histories of translation and dictatorship alongside Rockhill's account of Western institutions, I guess my question is, does Western Marxists still name a stable theoretical formation, or does it reproduce a geography in which theory belongs to the West and revolution belongs elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a good question. Is in my opinion is quite complicated. What I mean actually to understand, you know, the how Western Marxism, so-called as Lukács, is
Mm.
influenced, the Asian movement, Asian radical movements.
Yeah.
Well, Lukács actually were already, introduced into Asian the context in the 1910 and 1920. So almost contemporary. That means that actually we were actually, the influenced by Western Marxism, quite early stage, from the quite early stage. What I mean, when the Korean the communist movement is organized, we can find out, even we have the kind of literary movement called the CUF, proletarian movement, proletarian literature movement. So there actually you can find out lots of, the discussion, the discussion of revolutionary literature based on Lukács's concept. Actually, that means actually what? The Western Marxism does not exist, This Lukács and then, other actually the Kolshi and then the philosophical Marxism, okay, just I prefer this term. Yeah. Philosophical Marxism was a Marxist philosophy already influenced, the early stage of Asian radical movement. So you should actually take on this historical fact, and then you must actually rethink what is the meaning of Western Marxism. So, and then that is actually the first the reception that we can find out in the history of
Yeah. And
Asian.
that's something I've been grappling with as well.
Yeah, and then actually, okay, so after that is of course actually this so-called Western Marxism in Rockhill's term, commodification of okay the Western Marxism, started in the 1990 something, as the some actually what is the naming of some critical theory. That means university, as you said, is university and try to actually teach Western Marxism. It's not kind of the radical movement, the red Lukács and the red Kolshi, and then they discuss this kind of philosophical concept, for solving out their problem, which actually they found in their own movement. But of course, a university, would teach this kind of critical theory or some Western Marxism, whatever called, or some postmodernism or post-structural fancy theory, whatever called. Actually, they started to teach it. That might be actually called the reification of philosophy, reification of Marxism. We could actually say that, but that is a little bit different dimension, in my opinion, different dimension. So, but Frederick Jameson, and they clarify this one. This is kind of reification of theory. And reification theory very ambiguous. It also marks the failure of the kind of revolution movement. At the same time, what it actually it also show that a promise of this utopian dream. It means actually theory could contain this kind of a failed utopian dream. And then question remained. What kind of question remained here? In my opinion, if you agree with that, actually this is some reified, the utopian the dream or some utopian project, and then we must actually think about how to unfold this actually crystallized, the idea of this utopianism or some, in my own term is communism. Okay, just the idea of communism. How can we actualize this reified, communism, in the practical, the dimension? I think that is actually real question remain. When you actually come across this kind of reification theory, not just you actually simply rejected this one. This is the CIA, the byproduct, the CIA commodity. We simply actually rejected that one, and we don't need actually this one. No, I don't think actually even the Lenin didn't say like that. Lenin said that we need the theory. If you actually bring in that kind of practice, that is what I mean. Is without the theory, practice cannot come out. That's what I mean, and vice versa. And this kind of dialectical process is very necessary to understand any theory. So, of course, we criticize institutionalization of actually this, theory, and then also the what is some university system or academia, which actually what is the keep promoting the kind of some reification. We can criticize it, but that criticism as such is practice. That is exactly okay, just I don't want to use this term, but the Western Marxist, the thought about, and the Western Marxist attempted to do, the in terms of a theory.
Yeah.
That is my opinion. That's why we need to unfold this actually refined theory, and then we should actually dismantle institutionalization of this theory, and then we actually what engage this commodification of theory. For what? For actually what is practicing the idea of communism.
Yeah. And I want to turn to Eval Yanekov, a Soviet Marxist who returned to Hegel consciousness and praxis against bureaucratic closure of the official doctrine at that time. One response to your essay, which came on Facebook, raised Yanekov's critique of Mao's dialectics and criticism made from within communism itself. When Marxist thought is judged through fidelity to an authorized line, does the possibility of communist self-critique begin to disappear is my question.
Yeah, sure. That is the second essay, in which I discussed the repercussion, actually, which produced by my early, essay or early review of Locke's book. Alenkov is, of course, not only Alenkov, is many other, Soviet theorists and then philosopher. One of them is Valery Prodoga. He wrote a very monumental book titled Mimesis. He wrote about aesthetic, and then this book is really secretly shared by many European artists. And then, for instance, one of them is Hito Steil, and then I think she might be strongly influenced by the Prodoga. And then, anyway, what I mean, post-Stalinism. So I just post-Stalinist period, and then after the Stalin's death, and then that post the Stalin period, we can witness many philosophical speculation on, why Stalinism came to exist, or why actually the kind of the Soviet communist movement, or some Soviet movement as such ended up Stalinism. That was their main question. And then that question is already proposed by so-called Western Marxism. So actually that's why I thought, the Western Marxism is not just a Western something, just not actually the geographical or some geopolitical sense of some heretic Marxism. It doesn't mean that. So Marxism as such internalized this question, because Marxism as such is iconoclastic thought, And then that's why actually Marx defined communism in the German ideology, famously, what is all kind of struggle against the established order. Marx and Engels defined communism as a kind of movement, and then including state. That is communism. So of course, actually, Marx defined communism in many ways, different places, different works. But anyway, just that was the first, the definition you can find out in the Marx and Engels works. From this perspective, we can say that, actually the communism is a kind of movement, and then it's not just, the political movement, but also is a philosophical movement. Of course, Marx himself is really stood against philosophy in those days, but in those days, philosophy means very conservative, establishment, like a theological idea. It's idealism and metaphysics, but he just rejected that, some old sense of philosophy. But that's why he took the materialism rather than, the metaphysics, in this sense. So, but anyway, so in this context, we can say that actually this the Western Marxist the thesis could be shared by the many, the philosopher in the Soviet Union. That means the post-Stalinist, the Soviet Union, and then actually they raised the same question. And then, in my opinion, that is not quite new. The question seem actually return to what the Lukács already discussed. No, actually, his the critique of course, actually that is not a very the overt critique, but quite the secret critique of Stalinism. The in my opinion is the Lukács, the literary criticism. He didn't actually think his literary criticism as today's sense of literary criticism. He thought his literary criticism is a kind of political engagement, because he was a banned. He was banned to write about politics after the failure of Hungarian Revolution.
Mhm.
So you can find out what happened to him and his interview. His
Mhm.
interview is recently published by the Burso blog. You can find out. So in this sense, the Lenkov to the argument, Lenkov's interpretation of Marxism really actually shared, the many idea with the Western Marxism. That's why Western Marxism is not just a Western Marxism, but it's a Marxist, the thesis in general.
Yeah.
That means actually the what is that? It's okay, just as the Perry Anderson said. Perry Anderson used this term, as I told you, like impressionist. He didn't use this term in the positive sense. He used this term in the negative sense. So-called Western Marxism is very limited, and then they are really bit, too much the elitist or some kind of thing, or some too much, saturated Eurocentric, something like that is what he proposing when he wrote, this, the book about the Western Marxism. Okay, but even though he used this actually term is very negative sense, I think what he pointed out at some point is partially right. That means he said is Western Marxism emerged and the failure of a revolutionary movement. That is correct. That is what happened in Europe. But always actually, that as a human being can learn something by failure, unlike machine. Machine doesn't learn anything from the failure, but human being can learn the by failure. When you fail, then you can fix it, or you can actually learn something. You wouldn't repeat it, same error, something like that. So in this sense, Western Marxism would emerge, in midst of their kind of a political failure. Okay, they might be correct, but why? Why did they, take the philosophy to actually solve out that problem they found in the failure of political movement? That
Mhm.
is very good question. In my opinion, is a philosophy. Philosophy. Why did they take philosophy? In the for instance, I don't know. He tried to actually what is combine the Kantian sense of critique with the Hegelian dialectic, something like. And then they tried to find out, as Hegel did, the in his actually the period they try to the what is the find out, or they try to pursue possibility of the future in the middle of the kind of what depression,
Mhm.
some despair. Do you understand? This is really the modern, the sense of modern sense of actually the philosophy. The philosophy began with failure. Like today, I witnessed the total failure of post-war system. What happened in the Gaza and what happened in the Iran. We actually found out total failure of actually the kind of the political project. Liberalism is failed nowadays. Then lots of pessimism and nihilism, and then and despair is the really quite overwhelming these days. Everybody would, agree with it. Only fascism promised people, only, authoritarian movement promised the people, or some nationalism, people promised the people, future. But in the middle of this kind of despair, I think the Western Marxism in those days, they also experienced a similar situation in Europe, you know, because we have a similar situation. So actually the 1930, rise of fascism and the total failure of the radical movement. But our situation is more actually what? More, pessimistic, because we don't have any Soviet Union anymore. Even China, I'm not sure actually China could be actually alternative to, this kind of failure. But anyway, in this sense, I would say, the Western Marxism, as Perry Anderson said, would emerge in the middle of the kind of failure. But
Mhm.
Perry Anderson didn't question what kind of actually, what kind of actually the reason Western Marxism had in those days.
Mhm.
And then I think actually the Ilenkov, the Ilenkov's philosophy showed that
Mhm.
what kind of actually the issue they had.
Mhm.
They actually the speculated in a failure of Stalinism.
Yeah.
The part is a question of dogmatism. Why this, the communist movement ended up with the kind of dogmatism?
Yeah.
You know, why actually, authoritarianism? Why actually this, communist movement against the fascism ended up with kind of another,
Mhm.
sense of, you know, the variation, the
Yeah.
fascist variation. That is a um, the Ilenkov, the question. And another one is, okay, this thing is always repetitive in human history, or history of philosophy. Think about that, the debate between, the Averroes and then Al-Ghazali, and then Islamic, the history of Islamic philosophy,
Yeah.
The question, the Al-Ghazali's question was what? Whether philosophy is what? Is helpful for faith, religious faith. But Averroes actually defeated, in the debate, and he was actually evicted to his home, the Cordoba, and then he went back to Cordoba, and then that means the end of philosophy is a philosophical discussion in the Islamic world. Even Spinoza also, the question same thing. The also Spinoza also suppressed by the Catholic, and then some even the what is the Christianity. He was actually suffered from that kind of the suspicion of the heresy.
Yeah.
But he also actually questioned the whether philosophy is helpful for religious faith. And the conclusion, or he tried to prove how the philosophy is helpful for the religious faith. That is always actually philosophy does. So actually, in this sense, I think the Ilenkov and then Western Marxism try to actually persuade the people. We need a philosophy to overcome, the political impasse. That is what I mean. Actually, Althusser and Sartre, discussed in 1960. Actually they agree that the French, the Marxism, the labor movement, the lacked philosophy. That's why actually that they wouldn't find out, some kind of exit of some political impasse, something like. They actually discussed this one, Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, and then we Althusser, in those days. I think that is a philosophical question about the political movement. The philosopher always speculated, based on their own, the engagement. They always proposed what? We need a philosophy to overcome or solve out this philosophical, failure. Do you understand? That is actually the reason why. So we have, the Western Marxism.
Yeah.
Of course, the CIA tried to use this one, but what I mean actually, if you have some actual question, actual problem through your own the political practice, I think this kind of philosophical insight would give you, some sort of a solution to engage this kind of failure, and then persuade the people, or some to let people actually the join, not just the fascism, but more actually the open-minded movement. As in my own minor communism is more like actually the difference, rather than